our next speaker, Marine Hugonnier. Marine Hugonnier was born in Paris. She's working across media, illuminates relationship between perspective, power, and geography, are actually the way supplementary knowledge modifies vision, such as her Seascapes Towards Tomorrow in 2001. She has done many exhibitions in Malmö, more recently in Braunschweig at the Philadelphia Museum in the US, at the Kunsthalle in Bern, and her work is in many collections from MoMA to MACBA in Barcelona. Now, many of her works have to do with geography, have to do with expeditions, excursions, so there could not be a better place to have Marine than the Royal Geographic Society. A very warm welcome to Marine Hugonnier. Now, Marine, we thought to do this as a dialogue, and actually, before becoming a visual artist, you studied philosophy and anthropology, and I was wondering, to begin with the beginning, if you can talk about how these interests feed into your practice.
I studied philosophy and anthropology, and it helped me sort of frame my thinking, structure my thinking. And each film that I make is the occasion to do research, and they are every time the result of these thought processes. I did one of the very first film I made was shot in Afghanistan. It's called Ariana. It was shot in the Panjshir Valley, which is a stronghold for the resistance in Afghanistan. The idea of the film was to gain access to the standpoint in order to understand how the landscape had informed history and vice versa. So the film became the occasion to question the idea of panorama as cinema, camera movement, or as a military standpoint, or as a pre-cinematographic experience. The second film, The Last Tour, was shot in Switzerland. The film is kind of like a sci-fi movie. It's set at the end of the age of spectacle, and the viewer embarks on a balloon ride over the Matterhorn, and it's said to be the point in time where the national park is just about to close. So that gave me the occasion to look into Lacan and post-war theory. The idea was that the blank point that the idea of the closure of the park was going to put on the map was mirroring, some kind of the cartography of the post-war theory, which is about expansion and closure of space. The Last Tour is a film where one could has more chance actually to see things for the last time than to actually discover them. And of course, the other layer in the film is that of it trying to make a reference to the idea of the last man in Primo Levi. The third one, which was part of the trilogy, was shot in Amazonia, traveling Amazonia, and for that I did extensive research in 15th century Florence, when the city was completely devoted to map making. The idea of the film was to reconstruct entirely in the middle of the Amazonia traveling shots. So all three of these films, the first one, Ariana, is about the military gaze, the second one is about The Last Tour, is about the tourist gaze, and the third one, Traveling Amazonia, is about what made actually the gaze possible.
Now, starting from this trilogy, I was wondering if you could maybe talk briefly about your connection more to anthropology and the sort of whole French anthropological tradition. We spoke about Marcel Griaule the other day, and you said it's actually less Marcel Griaule who influenced you, but maybe more Georges Devreux. And I'm interested in somehow the development of fieldwork practices in the 30s, and why you're kind of more interested in Devreux and just the whole connection to anthropology, really.
Well, I think Griaule's contribution to anthropology was extremely interesting because his method of investigation was to actually spend extensive amount of time and continuous time with the same population, and the other thing, which is the key point, to study system of representation to actually be able to map a society. I think it had his contribution, for example, to his retranscription of Dogon's cosmology and religious knowledge is absolutely fundamental in that fieldwork. Now, his other contribution, which is very interesting, he was a pilot, so he used aerial photography. And at the very, very beginning of my career, I was working at the Museum of Mankind at the restoration of ancient photography, and I had a chance to actually look at these clichés, and it was very interesting to think that somehow the shape of the Dogon cliffs were probably very informative in the way Dogon's mind was structured. Now, I hadn't studied Griot, I was much more into ethnopsychiatry, and to make it short in a few words, what was really interesting to me is that a pathology was always accepted and to be understood within a certain environment, i.e. a pathology was created by an environment, so there was a constant link between the two. So the medical center they had Hope in Paris, north of Paris, was to help immigrants to be treated their pathologies within their own language and culture. So anything that would escape rational medicine would be treated in that center. Now, I don't really think that what I do exactly falls onto the category of anthropology. I've been influenced by anthropology, but I sort of moved ground so I don't really have to fight all these models or invent it. I'm trying to invent my own, basically, and I think anthropology has tried to to question constantly its method of investigation, its methodology to actually search for the best way to be objective. And Claude Lévi-Strauss was always saying, we're dealing with subjectivity, with something that is extremely intimate, and we're trying to make objective rules. What I do is completely subjective, so I've really moved ground.
Your work talks a lot about the nature of images and also perceptions. I was wondering if that's intentional.
Yes, it is. I try to... The main core of the work is the study of system of representation. Now, all these films that I make are, in a way, I go far away, but in a way they help me to have a look of art to our own system of representation. So, Serge Danet used to say that cinema teaches me tirelessly to touch with my gaze the distance at which the other one begins, which is a really beautiful sentence. To me, cinema is a tool to help to assess these distances between me and the other. But mostly what I've tried to do is to look at our own system of representation, so it's kind of like a retro process, really.
I read that you see your work as a sort of anthropology of images, and that you see landscape as a form of cultural meditation. So I was wondering if you could expand on these things.
I think the expression of anthropology of images is not correct, scientifically speaking. If one wants to be correct, you would talk about anthropology, cultural anthropology, or visual anthropology. So what I was trying to do is probably to try to raise an eyebrow by using this expression. And the question would be, could cinema be a terrain of investigation? And could we think that there could be such a field study where it's actually the observer who studied and not exactly the observed? But this is a completely idiosyncratic expression, so it's kind of open to interpretation and discussions. No, the other part was landscape.
I mean, we spoke, before when we at lunch, we spoke about landscape as a form of cultural meditation. I mean, it ties in with the topic, really, of the marathon of maps, because I was wondering this idea of landscape and what you think about maps and their relation to landscapes. If you see them more of fiction or the truth?
I think landscape, like map, are probably construction of a reality, so they are adequate within one time, with one period of time. I don't think I've ever doubted maps, and the idea would be kind of a nice beginning to a sci-fi film. Imagine waking up in the morning and doubting all the maps that you know of. how scary that would be and how wonderful it could be to actually then be able to embark on a tour where you could start rediscovering things.
Now, to return to Griol, his work has come to be seen as not entirely absolute and objective mappings of cultural others. In particular, we think about his writings, which some deem a highly elaborate construction of certain realities. So I was wondering about that role of writing, because I was very interested in the idea of artists writing, and I've often edited artists' writings. I was wondering what role sort of the writing of plays. And also, I mean, I heard the other day that you're writing now your first feature film, so writing seems to be important.
Yeah, I keep notes of everything, and especially I started working, when I was working at the Museum of Mankind, I took notes about everything, and I sort of gathered them together, and I called the whole thing counterproductive works. The idea was to somehow resist formalization, and not everything was good about all these notes. I mean, some of them are very bad ideas of things that shouldn't be made, but some others were interesting in this precise form, just to keep them unrealized. And this idea of the restraint or withdrawal has informed my work a lot.
Now, one more question maybe before we talk about actually Ichok and the whole complex of Ichok. I wanted to ask you about photography, because we spoke about anthropological photography, but you take photographs as artworks. You also make a lot of works on paper. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about this aspect of your work.
The photographs and the work on paper are separate works, i.e. they're not like produits dérivés from the films. I treat the medium specifically. The first photographic project I did was I set a kind of expedition, went all the way up to Alaska. The idea was to take a photograph on the Bering Strait of the other side, which is Russia. And since the international date line runs through the Bering Strait, making a picture of the other side was virtually making a picture of tomorrow or of the future. The work on paper that I do, I've started making a very big series where I obliterate the image on the front covers of newspaper. And what I'm trying to do is actually to map the entire 20th century, all the main events of the 20th century, seen from different points of view, so from different newspapers from all countries around the world. And I really like this work because people have responded it surprisingly very well, probably because they are able to actually reconstruct from their memory the event and to sort of appropriate it to themselves.
Now, in the Royal Geographic Society and related to mapping, a lot to do with traveling, and you've traveled a lot and you've lived in all kinds of parts of the world. You've lived in France, in West Africa and America, now in London. Would you say that this has had an influence on the subjects of your interests and your work?
Yes, I guess so. I guess this feeling of being a foreigner or being misplaced is probably where I belong, or this is how I'm happy.
And that leads us then to the last question, which is your unrealized mapping project for the Mapping Marathon, which is a project with Ichok. And I'm very curious about this because we met at the moment of an exhibition called Traversée, and actually I was working at that time at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, and it was a mapping endeavor. We did a show mapping the young French art scene. You lived in Paris at the time, and we sort of had this rule of the game to follow Georgi Kepes and to go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge. We wanted to encourage each artist to collaborate with another practitioner. And your idea was extremely unexpected, because you said actually transdisciplinary happens very often in families, and suggested to collaborate with your father, who is an economist. So very often for different events, for different projects, you collaborate with other practitioners. And for here, you wanted to work with actually alpinism and the connection to the field of alpinism, which in relation to mapping I think is important to mention. They have next door here extraordinary maquettes of Everest, and in the Royal Geographic Society there's so many links to that, but it has remained unrealized because of the estate. Can you tell us about Marcel Ichok, about your interest in him, and what the project would have been had the estate agreed?
My favorite environment is the area of the Mont Blanc, and Marcel Ishak was a movie director who was also an alpinist. He worked with Paul-Émile Victor and Jacques Cousteau and Maurice Herzog. And his work would have been very interested. He would have been very interested to be able to present him here, because the link between moving images and map in his work was very interesting. He, for example, in the 50s, he was part of the very first expedition in the Annapurna. So they went to Nepal, and the first work that he did was actually to complete the existing maps that we had at the time of Nepal. So that's how started his whole process of wanting to film the expedition of Annapurna, and he actually had a prize at the l'Académie des Sciences in France for the maps that he did. So it would have been very interesting to actually be able to introduce you to his work, because he's not very well known in the contemporary art world, and his contribution to the idea of expedition, mountaineering, is truly extraordinary.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marine. Thank you very much. Thank you.